Thank you. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, good. Thank you. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I'm John Wilson, a trustee of the World Affairs Council, and your moderator for this evening. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest and author. Karen Elliott House is an adjunct fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and is the author of On Saudi Arabia, Its People, Past, Religion, Fault Lines, and Future, a book I've read in the last week, and it is absolutely fascinating. I really recommend it. She was formerly Senior Vice President of Dow Jones & Company and publisher of all print editions of the Wall Street Journal. Prior to that role, she was President of Dow Jones International Group with responsibility for all overseas operations, investments, and publishing partnerships. Karen House has received numerous journalism awards, including a 1984 Pulitzer Prize in International Reporting for her coverage of the Middle East. She has been a director of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Committee to Protect Journalists, as well as a former trustee of Boston University. She is vice chairman of the Board of Trustees of RAND and a director of the Center for a New American Security. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about Saudi Arabia and its future, please welcome Karen Elliott House.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to, can you hear me? To talk to all of you about the strangest country you'll probably never visit. It's a country so different from our own. Here we are very individualistic. There, the whole concept is being part of the community of believers and not doing anything that disrupts harmony. There, a woman never reaches an age of maturity. Some of us would like that, actually, at my age, but never reaches an age of maturity in which she's able to be without some male guardian, even if it's her child. And obviously, as you know, she can't drive and must appear in public covered in black. We are a very secular society, and that one is obviously one dominated by religion. Men obey Allah, and women obey men. Allah is distant. Men are very much at hand, and sometimes using their hand on the women nearby. The whole country was probably less strange for me than it would be for most other people. I grew up in a very tiny town of 900 people in the panhandle of Texas, where religion was also our only source of entertainment. Like Saudi Arabia, we had no movie theaters. And like Saudi Arabia, my father was a very authoritarian man who my mother and all of us obeyed without question. There was no alcohol, no shorts, no pants, no dice, no dancing. So at many levels, I felt at home in Saudi Arabia. People always ask me, why did you why does this country interest you so much? Actually, when I finished the book, the editor at Knopf said to me, why did you do this book? And I said, because Saudi Arabia is interesting. And she said, Paris is interesting. Why did you spend all this time on Saudi Arabia? You have to make me understand that. That was her only point on editing. And so I did have to kind of sit down and rethink to myself, how can I make anyone who reads the book understand what fascinates me and hopefully be fascinated by it. I spent 30 years going there, beginning as a reporter for the Wall Street Journal, covering international politics. So seeing Saudi officials and focusing on geopolitical things, oil, Iraq-Iran war, U.S.-Saudi relations, Arab-Israeli issues. So when I retired as publisher of the journal in 2006, the one thing I really wanted to do was see if I could understand Saudi society, what forces are at work, what is it like, what makes them the way they are, and what does that say about the future stability of the country. This was 2006. So I started going there in 2007, trying to see if I could actually get around the country, because you obviously can't purport to write a book about Saudi society if you go to Riyadh and Jeddah. Even though 80% of the population lives in three cities, Riyadh, Jeddah, and Dammam in the eastern province, it would be like trying to write about the United States by visiting Washington and New York. So I started with people I knew, and I was able to get all over the country and to see all kinds of people, princes, poor people, young people, old people, males, females, religious officials, and some very religious conservatives, modernizers. And it was definitely an advantage to be a woman, because a Western woman in Saudi Arabia is really an honorary man. So you can talk to women, and you can talk to men. And very conservative Saudi women obviously would not be willing to meet with a male journalist. The society is much more diverse than we know. I mean, we tend to think that Saudi Arabia is a religious monolith with the women all wearing black and the men all wearing white, and the men in charge. There's much more diversity of people and opinion than I realized from going there for 30 years, just seeing officials. It's also much more divided than I knew, and it's much more dependent. People are much more dependent on the government than I ever understood. On diversity, there are poor people. 40% of the population lives on less than $1,000 a month. We tend to think of Saudis as being rich. 60% of the population is under 20 years of age. So it's a very young population. And about 40% of the 20 to 24-year-olds are unemployed. The divisions in the country are not only the segregation of men and women, but there are regional divisions, tribal divisions, religious sects, Sunnis, which is what most of the population is, but there is a minority Shia population, and most of those people live in the eastern province where the oil is. People tend to distrust each other, so they stay in their family, they stay with what's familiar. The country is, people are much like mummies wrapped in the bindings of tradition and religion, with what I would describe as immobile. And I think in part the government wants people to be dependent. There has been I think it's fair to say, a divide and conquer strategy by the ruling family to keep people separated and in their own little piece of the national labyrinth. So that the society reminded me of those stacks of Russian dolls, you know, those wooden dolls. Inside is the individual Saudi, inside his family, inside his tribe, inside the religious shell, inside the Al Saud royal ruling shell. But the internet and social media in general are really breaking down these walls. People can communicate in a way they never could before. When I started going there in 1978, you know, what you saw on TV was mostly prayer and religious programming. And now there's satellite TV. You can, not only somebody visiting like me and living in a hotel, but any Saudi, you know, can have a satellite dish and watch the BBC, Fox, CNN, Syrian TV, Egyptian TV, all kinds of things. So they're much more in touch and hear other views of Islam, not just the Wahhabi version that is preached by the religious establishment. So young people are listening to other views and asking questions, which is quite new. There are fundamentally three pillars of stability in the country: the royal family, the religious establishment, and oil wealth. And the royal family uses the religious establishment and oil wealth to control people. The religious establishment to set rules on people, and oil wealth to pacify people. It is very hard for us to imagine how omnipresent religion is in the country, because here, obviously, schools must not propagate religion, and there, that's fundamentally the sole purpose of education, is to perpetuate religious teaching. And we also don't have in every airport, shopping mall, etc., the way they do, prayer rugs so that people at the appropriate times can pray. And as you know, everything does stop during the day. The business is closed. Women sit around shopping malls while the men all go down and pray in the provided places in the malls. But the religious establishment, which has a very symbiotic relationship with the Al Saud family, because back in the 18th century when Muhammad Al Saud wanted to conquer Arabia for his tribe, he met Muhammad Abdul Wahab, who wanted to reconquer Arabia for the one true God. He felt that the area had lost touch with the religion as propagated and by the Prophet Muhammad. It needed to return to a purer form. They linked together, and it proved to be easier for the Al Saud to conquer people fighting in the name of Allah than in the name of the Al Saud alone. So it's a marriage that lasts down to this day. But the religious establishment is losing some of its credibility because they are increasingly seen by Saudis as doing the will of the Al Saud as opposed to the will of Allah. In 1990, when the Saudi king wanted to invite American troops into Saudi Arabia, he asked the religious for a fatwa or a ruling that said this would be consistent with Islam, and he got it. And obviously a lot of Saudis, not just Osama Bin Laden, felt that this was improper to have infidels in the land of the two holy places. More recently, in 2009, the king opened a very well-endowed new university called the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology that mixes men and women, the only place in the kingdom where men and women go to school together. And one of the senior religious scholars was asked on a TV show, is this proper, since all the preaching is you do not mix? And he said no. And the king, who appoints these 20 religious scholars, fired the man. And then some of the others began to discover that the prophet had had his hair washed by women, and, maybe this mixing is not so bad. But things like that, when the whole society is told you don't mix, and then the king can open a university because he's trying to reform education in the kingdom, it causes a disconnect for Saudis to see the gap between the way religion is preached and practiced. The oil wealth that the family uses to buy acquiescence, if not loyalty, is obviously dependent upon oil exports. Despite many 5-year plans over the last 40 years, the kingdom's revenue is still largely comes from oil. So 90% of the treasury is actually from oil revenues. So as people, the population in the kingdom grows, and the kingdom subsidizes energy inside Saudi Arabia. So basically a barrel of oil is $10 there, not the 100 or so that the rest of the world pays. People waste it. So the consumption of oil domestically is rising rapidly, which means that at least Saudis fear they will have less oil to export and thus less revenue, and who's going to fund us, because Saudis basically work for the government or they don't work. 90% of the employees in the private sector are foreigners. And the government is trying to get Saudis jobs in the world of work, but because most are not educated for the world of work, it has been a slow and thus far not very successful process. The third pillar, the royal family itself, also has some, I think, significant issues now, because when the founder of modern Saudi Arabia, Ibn Saud, died in 1953, he had fathered 44 sons by 22 wives, and the crown went to his eldest son and has continued to pass from brother to brother. And that band of brothers is all very elderly and most ailing at this point. So the king, who is 90, has already survived since 2005. He's on his third crown prince. The crown prince in waiting that has just been named is the youngest brother, and he's 67. So as far as one can see, it's a bit like the old Soviet Union in the 80s when Brezhnev died and was followed by a half-dead Andropov, who was followed quickly by a half-dead Chernenko, who was followed by Gorbachev. And by the time he got the chance, it was too late to do much. But if you remember, Reagan dealt with, I think, 3 Soviet leaders in about a 3-year period, and famously said, "They keep dying on me." And that's a bit of what is happening and will continue to happen. There are hundreds of nephews of this band of brothers, but there is no clear successor. And the fact that they named this youngest brother, the 67-year-old, I think is evidence that they can't agree on any of the nephews. So a lot of Saudis worry what's going to happen. They have no say, obviously, in who their next leader is, but young Saudis worry that the cousins might fight among each other. Other people say, don't worry, and the U.S. government certainly says this, that the Al Saud family understands that if they don't hang together, they'll all hang separately. So, it will carry on, but I'm not entirely convinced. Because young people do have a different view. I mean, I didn't encounter people who were begging for democracy. I mean, a few, but that's not the primary view. But the young people do not, because so many of them are so young, they don't have a recollection of Saudi Arabia as a truly poor country. So they don't have real gratitude toward this royal family as somebody that brought us out of the desert and with nothing, and used the oil wealth to send us to college, etc. They have the view that money belongs to us, not to the royal family. It's the country's money, and why should I have to go beg a prince to get my child into a good hospital or to get my son into a good university? And so the government is doing a lot to try to pacify people. After the Arab Spring, King Abdullah came home and passed out $130 billion across the whole society to the religious, to increase student stipends, to, for the first time, create a minimum wage for Saudis, promised people better housing, etc. So the government spending is rising far more rapidly than their oil revenues are increasing. They are quite convinced of their indispensability as rulers. Even many of the royal family criticize the government and each other, but at the end, everyone, at least that I talk to, and I talk to scores of them, in the end get down to the point that without us, the country will splinter, that we are the glue that holds it together. So young people are not begging for democracy, but they do say we want more transparency of where the money goes. We want more accountability of what's done with the money, and when things don't work, that somebody should actually be held accountable for that. And we want rule of law, meaning we want as they explain it, we want the laws to be clear and equally enforced. Because fundamentally, the judge you get decides your sentence, and the more prominent you are, the more likely you are to be treated deferentially. So I spent time looking at car theft, for instance, as trying to understand, do people do this because they're poor and need the car, or do they do it because they're rich and bored? And it's mostly the latter. Young people have nothing to do because if you work for the government, essentially your day ends around 1 o'clock, and you can't go to the movies. You can't. There aren't sports clubs. There aren't. Affordable ones. So people get bored and steal cars to race them and have fun. So the police say that they don't like to pick up the poor people who do this because the wealthy people who do it tend not to get punished. So I found that interesting, that there is what I call the increasing lawlessness in Saudi Arabia also surprised me. People like that who say, I don't really want to enforce that law because it's not going to be equitably enforced, so I won't do that. And a lot of Saudis seem to be willing to get away with whatever they can because they see a lot of corruption, and they say, well, if they can do it, I can take the sheets from my hospital bed, or I can run red lights. I mean, kids, they have electronic ticketing. If you run a red light, you get the ticket on your cell phone. So, kids do things like steal police cars and drive them repeatedly through the light to generate tickets. Just a lot of stuff out of boredom. So there is a lot more going on there than we hear about. A lot more individuals willing to take risks. And I will close on this. Saudis watch 90 million YouTube videos a day, and there are only 28 million people in the country. So that's another thing people do for entertainment, if you will. And recently, a young woman, last spring actually, a young woman was in the shopping mall, and the religious police approached her for wearing red nail polish. And she took out her cell phone and said, "You cannot harass me," and filmed the whole encounter with them and put it on YouTube. And of course, half the country then saw this woman standing up to the religious police, and nothing happened to her. They have just sentenced a human rights activist to 10 years for, in essence, protesting the fact that the kingdom holds people without trial and without charges and without trial. And that protest, if you will, his protest, has been going on for some 5 years. And I think what actually prompted him to get that kind of tough sentence is women have begun to, the wives, mothers, daughters of these people being held without charges or trial, first began protesting at the Interior Ministry in Riyadh, just small numbers. And then it moved to Beretta, which is the, as we would say, the buckle of the Bible Belt. It's the heartland of Wahhabism. And about 2 months ago, women were protesting in Beretta and all draped in black, and they burned the photo of the Minister of Interior, which is a pretty fearless thing to do. And I think the fearlessness of even a handful of women made the government think we need to get the intimidation going again. And this gentleman and his colleague, their human rights organization was shut down, and they've both been sentenced to 10 years. And so far, our government hasn't said anything. And on that happy note, I'm happy to take your questions. Shall I sit again?
At whichever you like. That's fine, sure. I really do want to recommend this book to you. It is a fascinating read. It's roughly 250 pages, and there is more detail, relevant detail, and fascinating detail about Saudi culture in that short space than you can imagine. So it's an absolutely fascinating read. And one question I have for you is, if you were to take a box of your books with you the next time you go to Saudi Arabia, could you sell them? Would it be for sale, or is there censorship of books, including in places like hotels, airports, and so forth?
Yeah, I got myself a Kindle when I started this project because you cannot really buy books in Saudi Arabia. The hotels have picture books in Saudi Arabia or things like that. There's not a Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, I'm told, bought 50 copies of my book and distributed them to, he's the billionaire businessman that gave money to New York, and Giuliani gave it back. But it is not, I have heard from Saudis who have read it, but they, get it on Amazon, or they buy it outside the kingdom. I sent a few in to people, and they received them, but it costs about $60 a book to send, so I didn't send one to all my most intimate friends.
and would, if you were to take your book into Saudi Arabia, would you be subject to arrest, or would they just confiscate the book?
I don't know. Every time I went in, I took both my Quran. I've read the Quran 3 times now. Mine's totally underlined and annotated. I took both the Quran and a little Bible and a little Quran, and nobody ever, took them. If I were to try to enter with one of my books, probably nothing would happen. If I had a suitcase filled with them, they might take them.
Right. I think there's a common misperception about Saudi Arabia. One of the questions here is, how can a society that at one point was so advanced with mathematics and other things, how can they have stepped backward? In your book, you note that oil was discovered in 1938, I think, and prior to that time, it was really an agrarian
raging society.
Yes, and not particularly developed. But I did want to ask about that. Historically, is there a respect for learning or a reverence for learning or intellectual curiosity other than as those things relate to religious thought and religious learning?
I would say by and large, no. It's part of what King Abdullah is trying to revive. I mean, this house of wisdom, that the Caliph, al-Rashid and Mamun and et cetera in Baghdad. And that's what he sees his university as being a beginning of trying to get people to be curious again and to understand that there is a history of Arabs with intellectual contributions. Indeed, they put out a book. The Ministry of Education has put out a book of 100 or 1,000, 100, I think. Things we owe to, which I was given a copy of. But mostly the learning is focused on the Quran, not on questioning is not a really approved of Saudi trait. The whole idea of philosophy is not a subject that anyone studies. The idea of questioning where things come from. You are supposed to, it's kind of like that, I think it's Alfred Lord Tennyson line, ours is not to question why, ours is but to do or die. I mean, that's largely the attitude, and the king is trying to revive some interest in intellectual learning. But I spent a lot of time on university campuses, men and women, and in high schools, public and private. But what most of the professors say is students really have almost zero intellectual curiosity. They just, want to take it down and regurgitate it. In that sense, it is very different. We have students, too, who just want to take it down and regurgitate it. But there are some who have a genuine curiosity here and are certainly encouraged. We are to think you can do whatever you want to do, which is not the view there.
There's so many contradictions. You note in the book that roughly 40% of the population has internet access. They also have access to foreign television. The question I have is do you see real evidence, beyond watching YouTube videos and so forth, do you see real evidence of an awakening, an intellectual awakening, as a result of access to these outside influences? I mean, is it tangible? Is it something in the period that you traveled to and from Saudi Arabia in the course of writing the book, did you see a real difference in the attitudes of the people?
Now, there's a lot of frustration, but not much, I would say, deep thought or intellectual thinking about what could we do to improve our lot. Because, I think the government doesn't encourage that because it doesn't want people getting too thinking too much or being too independent, and so there's a lot of frustration, but not any directed at any particular solution or acceptance of responsibility, even because people have this view you are controlled by your family. I met with a bunch of young guys from Imam University, the premier religious university, and I spent several hours talking to them, and one of them, his father had told him to be a doctor, so he was studying, even though he didn't really want to. But they did have, another one said, I said, which religious leader do you follow? Who do you trust? He said, I don't. I read the Quran and decide for myself, which I thought was a good sign, because most people have this view that you must not bring shame on your family. You must do what you're told. You must keep harmony. So the idea that you would think for yourself is really not a common. I'm repeating myself, but it's not a common practice.
In your book, you devote quite a bit of time to Saudi Aramco. And could you just comment tonight on the influence of Saudi Aramco, both positive and negative, in Saudi culture?
Louder, please.
In Saudi culture, I'm sorry.
Would I comment on the influence of Saudi Aramco in the culture? It's really an island. It is a normal place. If you go to Aramco, they have a movie theater. They have they don't have a mosque. Their service is in a building that has no minaret. And they also obviously allow Christian services. The religious police do not go on the Aramco compound. Nobody goes on the Aramco compound without, clearance. But it has attracted the best and the brightest. So the people who they have now begun to allow women to apply for scholarships. They pick the bright guys and now women and send them abroad for education, and they come back and work at Aramco. So it's a totally, to me, fascinating place because it's got a mixture of Saudis, Sunnis, Shias, Westerners, Asians. I mean, it's got everything. People sit in the cafeteria and talk to each other. Some are covered, some are not. There's a kind of live and let live acceptance, professionalism in the whole place, but it doesn't really, I don't think, affect the culture at large. It's seen to be an island. So people self-select to go work there, but the way it operates does not seep into the way the rest of the country operates. And the same is true of King Abdullah's university, the new university. It's an island too that you cannot visit without permission. So the normal Saudi doesn't walk through King Abdullah University and look at men and women mixing. That's all off limits from what anybody has to see, and I think its effect on the society will be about the same as Aramco's, not a lot.
Could you comment on the treatment of the foreign labor force by the Saudi government? Do they have rights of any kind? What's their situation vis-a-vis education? Can families live with the workers? Do they live in, completely separately from the Saudis? How does all of that work?
It depends on what level of foreign worker you are. But the interesting thing about Saudi Arabia is after you enter and a Saudi stamps your passport, you can go a long time before actually interacting with another Saudi. The person who takes your bags to the taxi is from Pakistan or Bangladesh. The doorman at the hotel is from Pakistan or Bangladesh. The people behind the counter that check you in are Lebanese, Pakistani. The guys that serve coffee in the lobby are Filipino. Saudis are not doing any of those kinds of jobs. So there are white-collar foreigners. Some of those do have their families and they live in compounds, or they can, in some cases, clearly just rent an apartment or a house if they can afford it, and in the wider community. But most foreigners are living with other foreigners, and if you're a menial laborer, you do not have a family. So this is one of the things Saudis say about we can't work at the wages that people pay in Saudi Arabia because the Indian, the Bangladeshi, the Pakistani, the Filipino, he's there to make money to send back home so that his kids can get an education or an operation or whatever. So he's happy to work 16, 18 hours a day because there's nothing to do when he's not working. And he's living in some rundown place that he certainly doesn't want to sit around and spend time. So they work, and thus they work at wages and hours that no Saudi wants to work at. You don't have a family, you work for 16, 18 months, and then if you can afford it, you go home for a couple of months, and then you come back and it all starts over. But, some of the places those people live are not very nice. Right. And they don't have any rights, and this is what happens to them. Once you're in the country, you're basically the property. You're even lower than a woman, a Saudi woman. You're the property of whomever got you the visa. And so if that person beats you, mistreats you, you can't say, well, I'll quit and go somewhere else. And so there's a lot of, obviously, corruption and all of that, people buying their ways out of abuse and, trading visas. And, if you get caught, you can get thrown out. So it's not a pleasant life. You tend to need to behave if you're going to, and pray that your employer is nicer than many are.
So I just want to briefly describe a few of the points that she has made in the book. That when you take them together, I think it's so fascinating as a portrait of this culture. So 70% of Saudis are under the age of 30. 60% are 20 and under. 40% of Saudis live in poverty. 60% can't afford to buy a home. There's a 40% unemployment rate for Saudis between the age of 20 and 24. And this is where I find it staggering. The young men and young women are not permitted to mix, as I understand it. The preferred marriage partner is one's first cousin. Mm-hmm. And marriages are arranged. Is that right? How does a young woman or young man find a spouse? How does it happen? Your
mother finds it for you. I mean, I years ago when I was the one other time I went all over the country in 1982. So I asked everybody I met, "How did you meet your wife?" So this one guy told me that he knew a female biology teacher who wanted him to help her do something. And he said, "I will, if you give me pictures of the 10 prettiest women in your class." And she said, "I can't do that," and declined. And then she still wanted something, so in the end she did it. She gave him pictures of the women. He took the pictures to his mother, and he picked the one he was most interested in, and she picked the one that had the best family. And so they compromised on one of these women, and then he wanted to actually see her, right. And so he went to there are beach areas, and if you're with your family, you can be undraped. So he rented the house next to where he knew she was, and he spent the weekend with binoculars watching her and decided, yes, indeed, he's willing to do this. So then the mothers arrange it. I mean, people, women, I never thought about this, but it makes total sense. A young woman has to impress older women. So that's how you get on somebody's radar screen. And this lady Lulu I lived with, the religious lady, I lived with this very religious woman. And her daughters, are totally happy. I asked the eldest one, how do you think your life is going to be different from your mother's? And she said, without any sarcasm, my mother is doing everything humanly possible to make sure I have a life exactly like hers. Now, I am sure there's no mother in this room that has heard that from her daughter, that what I want is a life exactly like yours. At least I haven't heard that from mine. And I saw the girl when I was there in January, and I said, how are you? I'd ask her then, are you going to get married before you finish college? And she said, it's not up to me. And so in January, I said, well, have you had any marriage proposals? And she said, yes, that 2 men had been there with her father. And she sat here and they sat here. And that one of them kind of talked to her too clinically, so she was not interested in him. And the other one she rejected because he didn't have a university education. So clearly, even in the most conservative families, there is a level of give and take going on that doesn't.
Is there divorce?
50% of all the marriages. It's a very high divorce rate.
There is divorce?
Oh, yeah.
Can a woman divorce a man?
If he's agreeable. It's very hard if he's not. Men can divorce women. But if women, I had a very prominent government official say that, his daughter wanted to get divorced from the husband, and the guy said, if you'll pay me $1 million, I will. And in the end, he had to do it because he wanted to get his daughter out of a bad situation. But, basically, the courts don't look too kindly on women complaining about things. There is a lot of child abuse and female abuse, and King Abdullah's daughter is very active on trying to work on that. There are female doctors and female pediatricians see this stuff and are now, reporting it, but they say frequently when you report it, it simply gets blamed on the girl is crazy and we need to take her and pray over her or, something.
And it must be very difficult for the women because the opportunities in the workforce are so limited. So if they are divorced, presumably they would be dependent on the state, I would assume. Is that?
Well, then you're dependent on your father.
Yeah, family and family.
Or, maybe the husband on his way out gives you something, but, it's more you're dependent on your father, or you have to try to find, which is another reason I think there is more pressure from women to work now, so that I say in the book 12% of the workforce is women, and I just read today that it's now up to 16. But the pressure to work comes about because there are more women who are divorced, and there are more women, even who aren't divorced, who want things for their children. If you want your child to have a good education, most people think they have to send the child to a private school. That costs money. So, in that sense, like here, people want things, and the pressure for two people to work in a family grows.
Another of the points that you make very effectively is that to a certain extent the ruling family is distrusted because they are too close to the United States. And to the extent that we attempt to exert any influence in the country, it's quite risky because there's likely to be a backlash. So what policy should we have in terms of encouraging reform, trying to incite some type of Arab Spring in some fashion or another in Saudi Arabia?
My feeling is right now, what Saudis want is not that hard to provide a little more freedom, openness, and that if we were simply consistent about enunciating our principles of believing in free speech and opportunity and human rights, it doesn't do a lot of good to publicly berate them. But I think, just maintaining a consistent position. I was just on a panel yesterday in Los Angeles, and the State Department representative said, we stand up for our principles of human rights and, opportunities, et cetera. And as the moderator of the panel, I felt obliged to not look like a fool by pointing out that, we're not too consistent. We're Bahrain or, Saudi Arabia or some, and we have interests. So I'm not saying we should just wash our hands of our own national interests, but I think if we cannot influence them a lot, despite the fact that a lot of Saudis think, we have picked the next king and that it's Mohammed bin Nayef, one of the nephews who's been made head of Interior, and President Obama met with him about 6 weeks ago. And so for them, that was the sign that Mohammed bin Nayef has now had the sign of the cross made over him by the President of the United States. But I think if we just keep saying what we stand for, that it's better than not ever being willing to talk about the country of Saudi Arabia. I mean, in the president's speech after the Arab Spring, he never even mentioned the word Saudi Arabia. And in the foreign policy debate between Romney and Obama, the word was mentioned only twice, and that was Romney accusing Obama of kowtowing to King Abdullah when he met him and allegedly bowed or did. So the American government is very unpopular in Saudi Arabia, but Americans are actually very popular. Saudis do not dislike Americans because they do like to come here. They do like the freedom. They seem to be perfectly willing to go back then and fit back in. But as I quote one of the princes saying in the book, we can't continue to live only when we're outside the country and exist inside. And I think that there is some truth to that. They are going to have to make it easier for people to live inside the country with a little less rigidity and rules, and that's not too hard to do. But I think they fear that if you, as my mother would say, give an inch, they'll take a mile, that if they loosen up on some things, that it will only increase the demands among the modernizers for more, 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 and then eventually cause a backlash among people like my friend Lulu that I lived with, who just, all she wants is to get her family to paradise. She doesn't want to drive. She doesn't want anything to do with anything in this world. She's just trying to keep the family on the right path.
In one of your final chapters, you suggest various reforms, an expansion of elections, and potentially a partially anyway elected parliament, a prime minister and a council of ministers chosen based on competence rather than genes. Those were your words, not mine. Rather than genes. Reduced influence of the conservative clergy in education and generally, and then modifying the line of royal succession to something other than an absolute monarchy. Which of these do you think is realistic in the near term?
I think they could, now that the king has appointed 30 women, they have this Majlis Ashura, this consultative council, which I describe as a Potemkin parliament. But it does allow people to meet and talk. And the king appoints 150 people. This time he appointed 30 women among the 150. Having done that, it seems to me they could have an election for the parliament. Now, what people fear is they had municipal elections, and the municipalities have no power, so they didn't mean anything really, but they had them. And of course, women could not vote or run. But the only organization in the country really is the religious establishment, 70,000 mosques, and their ability to mobilize. There are no other civil society institutions, nothing around which people can organize, because that's not permitted. So there is a risk, and this is what the Saudi royal family will tell you. You know, the risk is that if we have an election, you'll get nobody but religious conservatives. And that's true, because they have made anything else impossible. But somewhere I think they are going to, the things that they believe provide their stability, at some point I think are going to become the sources of instability. You know, the rigidity is, for young people, is not going to be as acceptable as their parents and grandparents found it.
Yeah, and actually one of the points that you make is that a society can look very stable one moment and actually be quite fragile and brittle, and that could very well be the case here.
Yeah, I think we all thought the Soviet Union was so stable that we, as a government, have a tendency to confuse stagnation with stability, and they're very different. Something can be stagnant and thus look stable, but it's not stable. So, I mean, there's a great de Tocqueville quote, which I can never totally remember, but about the French Revolution, that something to the effect that things that what is it, that were oppression, that's not the word he used, but that you thought was inevitable, once it is, you conceive that it's not inevitable, becomes unbearable. And so it's a great quote. I don't know why
That's
I
it.
can never commit
That's
it to
it.
memory,
No,
but
but that's
but
essentially
that's
it.
the point,
That's
that
right.
what
Right.
you thought was inevitable, once it's not, but you discover that, becomes unbearable
Very quickly.
very quickly, yeah.
It is a fascinating book, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I enjoyed the evening. Thank you for your questions. That concludes our program for this evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I ask you to join me in thanking Karen Elliott House for her excellent talk and discussion. I'd like to remind you that her book on Saudi Arabia is available for sale, courtesy of Books, Inc., and she will be available to sign copies on stage. Many thanks to all of you, the audience, for your questions and participation. Thank you.
Thank you very much.